Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Did the Prophet Muhammad receive secondary inspirations outside of the Quran? This is an interesting question because traditional Muslims will claim that the Prophet did receive secondary inspirations outside of the Quran, which they call the Sunnah of the Prophet, and they believe they are following the Sunnah via the Hadith literature. Then you have on the other end of the spectrum some Quran alone followers who will say, no, the only inspiration given to the Prophet was the Quran alone. Now, in my understanding from the Quran, both of these notions from both of these parties are right and wrong to an extent. So, of course, the best way to answer this question, did the Prophet Muhammad receive secondary inspirations outside of the Quran, is to look at examples from previous prophets in the Quran. Let's take an example from Prophet Musa. Prophet Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and there was this communication happening between him and God, this wahi, this inspiration that was happening between him and God. God told him, throw down that staff turned into a serpent. Moses got scared, he tried to run off, God told him to come back. So there was this communication, this inspiration happening between God and Moses. And obviously this communication that was happening between them was not part of the message that Moses was supposed to deliver to the people. It wasn't until God gave Moses the tablets, the alwah, and he told him, take this information, this message to the people and deliver it to the people. That's when Moses went down the mountain and gave the people the message of God. So here in this scenario of Prophet Musa, we see that there were two means of inspiration. There was the actual revelation, the message that Moses was supposed to deliver to the people, the alwah, or what the Quran also calls the kitab, to the people. That was the inspiration of the message itself to the people. Then there was that secondary inspiration outside of the message that was happening specifically between God and Moses, which is not part of the message. And we can take the same example, a similar example from Prophet Noah. Prophet Noah, God told him, go to the people, tell them worship God alone, there's no other God beside him, and so forth, right? Then God told him, build an ark, and you'll build it with our inspiration. And so God was instructing Noah how to build an ark, right? He told him, take this piece of wood, put it over here, assemble it this way. Obviously, so there was two means of inspiration. There was the inspiration that was part of the message of Noah, right? Worship God alone, there's no other God beside him, right? That was the message given to the people. Then there was the inspiration outside of the message, which was building the ark. So as we can see, based off of the examples of the previous prophets, prophets can receive secondary inspirations outside of the actual message. These inspirations, if we examine them in the Quran, these specific inspirations that were happening between God and the prophet, excuse me, was to fulfill certain plans and tasks oriented and geared specifically during the lifetime of that prophet. It's to fulfill tasks, to fulfill plans in order to be able to deliver the message, right? So this was the purpose of these secondary inspirations. So likewise, when we look at Prophet Muhammad, he's no exception. He was a prophet of God. He can receive inspirations outside of the actual message. Those inspirations were specifically to fulfill plans and tasks that are catered to be able to deliver the message of God. For example, if we look in Surah 2, God told the Prophet Muhammad that he has sent down angels to help assist them in a war, right? And the verses speak in the past tense, which indicate that Prophet Muhammad was already informed of this event. Surah 66, for example, God informed the Prophet that his wives were gossiping. Now, the Quran touches on these events, but it does not tell us the exact or the actual inspiration given to the Prophet about those events, indicating that the Prophet did receive secondary inspirations outside of the Quran. So of course now some people, particularly the Quranists, the Quran alone followers, they might say, wow, that's crazy, that's impossible, and so on. But these are actual examples from the Quran that we have taken. Now, the problem happens though, is are we required as Muslims, are we required to follow those secondary inspirations? This is the question that we need to answer. And of course, in order to answer this question, let's take the example of Musa again, Prophet Musa. When Prophet Musa came down that mountain, right, he had those tablets with him. The Quran tells us that these tablets contain the details of everything. The details of everything. Do you expect that the people at that time, when they received the tablets and Moses told them, this is the message from God, it contains the details of everything. Do you expect them to say, hey, thank you for these tablets, but what really happened between you and God up there? We want to know so we can follow your sunnah. Do you see the problem here? Of course, it would be silly of them to even ask that, but suppose that they did ask, and suppose that the Prophet Musa did tell them what happened. That has no impact. That information has no impact to their salvation. Their salvation is in the tablets that were given to them because it contains the details of everything. So I hope you see where I'm getting at here. The Quran tells you it contains the details of everything. This means that all the information that you need as far as your salvation is concerned is in this book. Whether the Prophet Muhammad received secondary inspirations or not is irrelevant to your salvation. This is why in Surah 27 it says, أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِهِمْ أَنَّ أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ يُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَرَحْمَةً وَذِكْرَى لِقَوْمٍ يُؤْمِنُونَ. Is it not enough for them that we have sent down to you, Muhammad, the book being recited to them? In this there is a mercy and a reminder for those who believe. So if you want to consider yourself of those who believe, you need to understand that the recitation of the Quran that was delivered to the Prophet, the actual message catered for the human beings, for the rest of humanity, is sufficient for your salvation. And this is precisely why God consistently tells us, obey the messenger, obey the messenger. He never tells us to obey the prophethood status. He tells us to obey the messengership status. Messengership status signifies that this prophet has received a specific message that he's to deliver to the people. Therefore, obey the messengership status given to you, which is the Quran. And this is also why when the people during the lifetime of the Prophet inquired with the Prophet about specific things, specific laws and specific rules, if their inquiry has a means of salvation, it's meant for the humanity's salvation, it would be inspired to the Prophet via the Quranic text. This is why when we look in the Quran, some people inquired with the Prophet. They ask you about alcohol and gambling, say. They ask you about women, say. They ask you about menstruation, say. You see that? This is the Prophet during his lifetime, God speaking the message through the Prophet in the Quranic text. So all inquiries about our salvation is in the Quran alone. We don't need to go to those secondary inspirations that are not even mentioned in the Quran or not even talked about in the Quran. We are required to follow what is mentioned in the Quran. All inquiries that the people inquired with the Prophet is mentioned in the Quran through the word qul, say. That's the real sunnah of the Prophet. Now, some people may be asking, well, how do we know during the lifetime of the Prophet? How did the people know whether it was the Prophet speaking or the messenger speaking? This is a very common question proposed by those who say, well, if he did receive secondary inspirations, how do we know who's speaking? And the answer is, this is where the idea of the salah sessions happens. During the salah session, right? It's during the salah session where God inspires to the Prophet the actual message of the Quran. This is where the Prophet would actually deliver the message to the people. During the salah sessions, that's when the people inquired with the Prophet. That's where the Prophet recited the Quran for the people, and so forth. It is during these salah sessions that the Prophet received the inspiration of the Quranic revelation. Outside of that time, he is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and all the messengers of God. He is Prophet Muhammad implementing the Quran in his day-to-day life. So yes, the Prophet Muhammad did receive secondary inspirations outside of the Quran, just like all of the God's prophets. But what we should be concerned about is the Quran alone itself, because that is the message that is given to us. Nowhere does God tell us, obey the Prophet. It's always obey the messenger, i.e. the person carrying the actual message. Wassalamu alaikum.